This week, I spent 3 days inside my house, not because I wanted to, but because the air outside had become too hazardous to breathe. The smoke from the Canadian wildfires had drifted hundreds of miles, settling over our little corner of the world. The familiar blue sky disappeared behind a beige veil, and even the sun seemed to lose its strength. It hung there for days like a pale lantern behind frosted glass, reminding me that sometimes we can know something is still present, even when we can no longer see it clearly. As I stood at the window looking out at a world I couldn't safely enter, I noticed something happening inside of me. There was a part of me that wanted to feel as though the earth was doing this to me, and it would have been easy to tell myself that nature had become hostile and that the world had somehow turned against us. But the longer I sat with it, the more the story began to fall away. The earth wasn't doing this to me. The earth was only responding to conditions. Months without enough rain, trees that had quietly aged until their wood had become dry enough to ignite, a lightning strike, strong winds arriving at exactly the wrong moment. One condition meeting another until what followed was almost inevitable. And somehow, standing there at the window, I realized that the earth wasn't acting out of anger or punishment. It was simply responding to the conditions it had been given. And that thought stayed with me long after I stepped away from the window, because I couldn't help wondering if we'd been asking ourselves the wrong question. When we find ourselves anxious or overwhelmed, and when we lose our patience more quickly than we like, and when we wake up exhausted before the day has even begun, we often ask ourselves, what's wrong with me? But what if there is another question? What if the true question is, what conditions have I been living inside? This week, many astrologers have been talking about an extraordinary moment unfolding in the sky. 4 outer planets are meeting in a configuration so rare that most of us have never lived through anything quite like it. And they speak of great change, of old structures loosening their grip, and of new possibilities beginning to emerge. And as I listened, I found myself less interested in predicting what might happen and more interested in noticing what was already happening. Because whether we're looking at the forest, the sky above us, or our own lives, one truth keeps returning. Conditions matter. Nothing changes in isolation. And a forest fire doesn't begin with a single spark. It begins months and sometimes years before anyone ever sees the first flame. And perhaps our own lives aren't so different. We are nature. Sometimes we think we've suddenly become impatient or discouraged or fearful, yet those responses have often been quietly forming beneath the surface for much longer than we even realize. They've been shaped by long seasons of uncertainty, and by caring too much for too long, and by living with questions that never seem to get settled, and by trying to remain steady while the ground beneath us keeps shifting. So the response isn't the beginning of the story. It's the outcome of the conditions. And As that realization settled into me this week, something else quietly followed. So if conditions shape what grows, then perhaps change doesn't begin by forcing ourselves to become someone different. Perhaps it begins by becoming curious enough about the conditions we're living in and the conditions we're creating. I think gardeners understand this instinctively. When a plant begins to struggle, they don't stand over it and demand that it bloom. They look first to the soil and they notice the amount of sunlight that it's getting, and they pay attention to the water, the temperature, and the nourishment that it's getting. They understand that healthy growth isn't commanded into existence. It emerges when the conditions support it. And I wonder how often we've forgotten to offer ourselves that same kindness. How often have we demanded blooming while ignoring the soil? And how often have we judged the flame without becoming curious about the drought? And perhaps that's what stayed with me most deeply this week. Not the smoke, not even the extraordinary sky, but the quiet reminder that life is always responding to conditions. The earth for sure is. Our relationships do. Our communities do. Our human system does. And maybe that realization offers us something that certainty never could. Because while we cannot always choose the conditions that arrive at our doorstep, we can begin to notice the conditions we continue to cultivate. Yeah. We can choose where we place our attention, and we can choose what conversations we nourish and what rhythms we protect, and what moments of stillness we allow ourselves to return to. Perhaps that is where our freedom has been waiting all along, not in controlling every storm, because we know that can't happen, not in preventing every fire. Most of the times we can't do that either. But in remembering that every day we are quietly participating in the conditions from which tomorrow will grow. As you move through this week, I wonder if you might become a gentle observer of your own inner landscape and not start by asking, "What's wrong with me?" Start by simply asking, "What conditions have brought me here?" Sometimes the answer itself begins to soften something. And sometimes, I would say most times, that softening is where all real change begins. The door is open, my friend.